guys, it's Joanna. I'm making another video. This video is going to be about ball pythons and their husbandry because I have been asked about it a lot, and I've been asked more about it recently, what with the reptile expo that happened and everything. So it's something that I also think is important to cover, so I just figured I would shoot it. Much like the last video, I will probably not be editing this one. That depends a lot on how much I screw up. I already have to videotape it because I was sitting on a beanbag and it was making so much noise. But hopefully this one works out. Anyway, so some real quick things people should know about ball pythons before they get one, even though they are a very easy snake, is that they are picky eaters. They are notoriously the pickiest eaters of any snake out there. So that is something you might have to prepare for. It can be stressful feeding them. They get to be about 4 to 5 feet long, depending on the snake and the sex and stuff. So that's also something you need to prepare for. A lot of people don't understand that they get pretty large, and that's a big reason they get rehomed. And they also live to be about 20 years, sometimes longer. So that's another reason people rehome them a lot, is because they think they aren't going to live that long, but they do. They live like longer than a dog. So you just gotta prepare for that a little bit. They also lay eggs, which really isn't a big deal. Sometimes the females can be gravid, which means they like have eggs and will lay them, but other than that, it's not like a super big deal. But it is something you should know about in case it happens and you get really confused. And feeding, because people ask me a lot about how expensive feeding is. It's really not that expensive, so at most they're going to be eating rats when they're older. And they eat, when they're young, they eat like once a week, and then when they're older, they eat like twice a month. So, yeah, it's not too bad, but each rat is like, I don't know, under $10, so it's not that bad. But getting into the husbandry, the first thing you need when you get any animal is some sort of enclosure or vivarium. You can see all of my vivs behind me. I use glass enclosures. I like them. I think they're more aesthetically pleasing. They are easier to deal with than tubs for me. Other people will use tubs, just like big plastic bins and stuff. The pro of the tubs is that it's a lot easier to keep in humidity, whereas these, it's a lot harder. But you just want to make sure that the tub is well ventilated if you do have it, so you aren't drowning your snake. Penny is... Go over there. But I'm gonna make a whole separate video on humidity because there are so many ins and outs to it, and it's so complicated and so annoying and difficult that I'm just gonna make a whole video. I might link it in the comments whenever I do film it, but plan for that. Regardless, when you have a tank, you want to make sure that it has a lock or is secure, because snakes are really good at escaping, so just make sure that it's secure somehow. And for baby ball pythons, you need a 20-gallon tank, and for adults, you need a 30 or 40-gallon. That basically means as adults, it needs to be about 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and they don't really need the height. One mistake I see people make a lot is they get these really tall enclosures, like 18-inch enclosures, and it doesn't need to be that big because they're terrestrial snakes. They don't really bask and climb like other snakes like boa constrictors do. So you really don't need the height or any branches or anything like that, but if you want it, you can go ahead and get it anyway. After you get your viv, you're going to want a substrate, and that's whatever you're putting on the floor of your vivarium for the snake to lay on. There's tons of different types. All are very related to humidity, which I'll talk about in the humidity video. But I like to use paper towels because I think they're the most sanitary. They're easy, they're cheap. But you can also use stuff like cocoa fiber, which is ground up coconut bark, and it resembles dirt. You can use cocoa bark chips, which is kind of more just like bark chips. And they have aspen bedding, but I'm not a huge fan of aspen bedding because I don't think you can really get it wet and stuff, and it's kind of messy. But those are all the common substrates for ball pythons. What you don't want to do, make sure you don't just like get dirt from outside because it could be toxic. It could have parasites. You don't want to use just soil from the store because like that can also have problems and stuff. And you don't want to do things like just buy random chips. Like I think cedar chips are toxic. I could be wrong, but things that are not specifically for snakes can be toxic and can cause lots of problems. So just make sure you're like buying the right thing. But after you deal with those things, the next most important thing is your temperatures. So you're going to want to make sure that your snake has a hot side and a cold side to its tank. Some people who have hundreds of snakes and breed them will just make it all one temperature. But people usually like to have a hot and cold side so your snake can thermoregulate on its own. And the ways to do that are that you can use a heat lamp, which sits on top of the tank or hangs above it. They look like this. Make sure I don't hit the mic. They look like this. You can get different voltages and stuff. Make sure you get the right one for your bulb. And for the bulb, you can just get any nightlight. Another common mistake I see is people using UVB lights, or I've even seen people use light bulbs. Snakes don't need UVB like other reptiles do because they're so hidden all the time, or at least ball pythons don't. Some snakes probably need UVB, but ball pythons do not need UVB. You can have one, but if you have it, make sure it's on a day-night timer because if it's on 24/7, it stresses the snake out a lot, just like it would with any other animal. So I like the night lights. I think you can also use infrared lights, but they put off a lot more heat, which you just want to make sure that you're not making the tank too hot, which is a thing that can happen. You can kind of track whether your snake is too hot or cold based on like if it's only spending one time on one side or not. Yeah, and the second way you should be heating your tank, which I have been told is the more important way if you're going to pick one because snakes need underheat to help digest their food. You're going to want an under tank heater, which looks kind of like this, and it's just a mat you stick under the tank. It's sticky, and it will warm from the underside. What you always want to have, and I'm notorious for talking about this, is if you have an under tank heater, which you should, you need to have a thermostat. So a thermostat is a secondary like appliance that look kind of like this. You can order them online, they're pretty cheap. You plug the heat mat in and it regulates the temperature, so it makes sure your heat mat doesn't get too hot. So that's so important because heat mats easily get to be over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Which will burn the belly of your snake, and you really don't want to have to deal with that. It's not, or it can be fatal at worst, and then at best, it's just really expensive to treat. So make sure you have a thermostat and are well prepared for your snake. That is another common mistake I see all the time. I don't think I mentioned it, but for the hot side of the ball python's tank, it should be 95 degrees Fahrenheit or less. For the cold side, you want it to be above 75 degrees Fahrenheit and try to keep it like within that range. You measure that obviously with thermometers. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of thermometer, or you can get a temperature gun. I have a temperature gun because it's easy. You just point and click and it measures the temperature wherever you're pointing. So if you have a lot of snakes or you don't want to buy like multiple thermometers, you can get this. Regardless, if you get a thermometer, you need to make sure it's digital. So there's a lot of digital ones that look kind of like this and they just drop down. That's because they sell strips in like weird plastic gauges, but those are so inaccurate, and temperature and humidity are things that you don't really want to like ballpark too much, just because it can have like consequences. So yeah, and as I mentioned, a lot of times you can get a hygrometer attached. So this one is a dual thermometer and hygrometer. Make sure you get a digital one. Hygrometers just measure the humidity in your tank, which is really important. And like I mentioned before, I'll be making a whole video on that because it's super annoying to deal with. But yeah, for humidity, for ball pythons, you should be keeping it between 50 and 60%. But again, like just try your best because it is really difficult. Where I live is pretty dry, ironically, because it rains here all the time. But do your best. Other than that, you want to have a water dish for your snake at all times. Some people say that it should be big enough for them to soak in, but for ball pythons, they really don't soak unless something's wrong with their husbandry, like either the temperature's too hot, they're trying to cool down, or it's too dry and they're trying to soak up moisture. So I kind of disagree with that as long as you have water at all times, but again, that is just a difference of opinion. You can do what you want. And finally, you're going to want to have 2 hides for your snake to hide in. That's important because snakes like to hide. You can get fancier ones, kind of like this. You can get cheap plastic ones. I've seen people make hides out of stuff. Your snake is not going to care. Just make sure you have two. That is like the last common mistake that I see is people just having one. And it's like, okay, well, if you have a temperature gradient in one hide, that doesn't really give your snake the option to move because it's going to want to be in the hide even if it's literally burning its stomach. So make sure you have the two hides. And other than that, just decorate it with anything safe. You can see I have like all sorts of decorations. I like to give the snakes like a log or something scratchy so that when they go to shed, they have something to rub against. It can make the shedding process easier. So yeah, that's kind of like my only, all the advice I have. Penny is like scratching herself right by the mic. So sorry if y'all can hear that. But that's all I have to say about it. If you guys have any questions, please comment or ask me, DM me, or whatever. Remember that I am not a professional. I am just a hobbyist, so there are things that could be more like up to opinion than others. But yeah, so just let me know. But thank you guys. Have fun raising your snakes.